na tej następnej sesji wystąpią takie tuzy nauki, że ja uznałem, że muszę siąść troszkę niżej, żeby był pewien i żeby nie przeszkadzać Państwu, będę siedział na dole. Mam nadzieję, że to nie będzie z tym problemu, natomiast myślę, że Państwo są głównymi bohaterami dzisiaj. Mamy 3 wystąpienia i nie wiem, czy mównica, czy będzie potrzebny komputer, żeby coś pokazać? Tak? To jest jedna prezentacja. Pan Marek się jak zawsze tym wszystkim zajmie. Dobrze, już mam nadzieję, że zaraz będziemy... No nie, jednak zejdę na dół, bo czuję się tutaj niezręcznie trochę tak. Szanowni Państwo, witam serdecznie na kolejnym, 8. już panelu naszego spotkania. Myślę, że będzie bardzo interesujący, poświęcony nie tylko kwestiom takim zasadniczym, badaniom podstawowym, ale będzie sporo takich dziedzin pokrewnych historii czy współpracujących.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that we will discuss quite a few aspects here which are beyond the core issues discussed, such as ethno-linguistics, for instance. We will approach a topic from the linguistic and holistic point of view, which goes a bit countercurrent to what the post-war propaganda sought to tell us, namely that we were dealing with a purportedly homogeneous society, but that was often not entirely the case, and that was something that the authorities tended to ignore, and opinion journalists and sometimes historians tend to ignore today, and leads to many misunderstandings. So that we are really dealing with here in the Western and Northern territories, to which people from different cultures came and from various corners of the world. We will be told about this by Professor Grzegorz Chryciuk, who will present a paper on the Great Exchange, an amalgam of the Western territories, the composition and origins of population of the Western and Northern territories of Poland in the first 10 years after the Second World War, 1945-1955.
Proszę Państwa, moje wystąpienie będzie wystąpieniem...
Ladies and gentlemen, my presentation will be more general in its nature, kind of gathering together what all the outstanding researchers before me have already done. So it's about this new community that formed in these Western and Northern territories after 1945, and that was in the first years was the subject matter of interest for politicians, and also studied by fields of geography and sociology. But then the right kind of atmosphere for historical studies emerged, and so historians developed an interest in this, and after some time it was safer to investigate these matters, and so this time distance made it easier to avoid the pressures that had characterized the research earlier. But the issues of the creation of a new community in the Western territories are something examined by historians and sociologists to a certain extent. Now, the Northern and Western territories of Poland, also referred to as reclaimed or recovered or regained territories, described as such in the post-war narrative, well, those were to be a remedy for the various ailments of ills of Poland at that time, civilizational ills and other problems, but for the political authorities at that time, it had a very very current, very topical nature, actually. And Władysław Gomułka said that that was supposed to bring together the population and the regime, and basically the possibility of living there, of settling permanently there, was something that the settlers were actually to be included in the efforts to support the political authorities. And in 1945, and for many years after that, especially when we're talking about the international aspect, but also the subjective aspect, the status of the Western territories was unclear and definitely uncertain, based essentially on Soviet support and on the tacit, conditional consent on the part of the Western superpowers. And especially in 1945, that was fueled by the presence of many millions of local people, Germans, or to a large extent a German population, and evacuation, escaping from the front line. After that, still a couple of million of people stayed behind, and the picture painted of these depopulated territories was only partly true. Yes, it is true that the evacuation, the escapes actually affected many northern and western territories, many parts of them, and depopulated them nearly entirely in certain cases. But in regions which until May 1945 were under German rule, for instance, the Sudets area, the number of people as a result of the influx of refugees even increased. And speaking of the Great Exchange, I actually allowed myself to use this term in the title. We should start by talking about the turning point, 1945, the end of 44, early 1945, the first days, the first months of that year, which was a decisive year because it is then that the Great Exchange started, so it's a watershed moment. From the point of view of the German population, perhaps it seemed temporary, and it seemed to have been forced by the Nazi authorities, and also forced by fear of the onslaught of the Soviet army. And in 1944, in Eastern Prussia, this information, this news that kept coming from the areas actually captured after a brief offensive by the Red Army, that news only encouraged people to escape in panic as far as they could go. Not everyone had this possibility, but hundreds of thousands, actually millions, decided to do so. After the end of military operations, May 45, the partly depopulated areas ruined by the victorious Red Army, some of the powiats, some of the counties started to become populated again, because the German population, under the rule of the Soviet army, of the Red Army, decided it was better to survive staying in their own family farms and homesteads. So this return did not concern only the lands on the Lusatian-Neisse and Oder banks, and the Lusatian-Neisse was supposed to be the new border, but also it concerned powiats located in the interior of that territory. So the returning Germans would end up in Trzebnica, Milicz powiats. So that was the on the very edges of the Reich still existing formally back then. And in order to put an end to this activity, which was presented as harmful by Poland, claiming these territories, it was decided, I guess, among other things, it was decided that military military troops would perform what was referred to as the wild, the displacement, or wild expulsions, actually. And, well, they didn't give too much of an effect because some of the people still returned, but it did discourage some. And also taking control at the border crossing points by the divisions of the revived Polish army, so that flux, that return flux was controlled in this manner. And nevertheless, the protests and the fear of international opinion, especially that of Western superpowers that had such a big influence on whether these claims related to territory and borders would be accepted. Well, that was a situation which in the second half of 1945, the displacement processes were more voluntary and less, the nature was less mass scale, and so, but there was at least situational pressure, not to speak of other factors, but whether, mass scale, right, the operation of displacing the German population actually started in winter 1946. With the approval of the occupational, with the authorities of the Soviet and the British occupational zone, where the people resettled from the western territories of, the eastern territories of Germany were supposed to end up. And that operation ended essentially in 1947, covering over 2 million people. In 1948 to 1949, those displacement processes were less on a mass scale, and they concerned people living in, well, former German areas. I don't know if I can call them that, but they concerned people of German origin from the territories of pre-war Poland, and they concerned prisoners of war. So that was not only movement coming from these northern and western territories, but at the same time, these first attempts of displacement of a very spontaneous nature started back in 45, and an influx of Polish people started for temporary residence, for temporary stay, to enrich themselves. We talked about the looting, but also an influx of people who tried to settle and make their lives anew, at least for a short time, in that area. But initially, major hopes were pinned on resettlement of Polish people from the eastern borderlands of Poland, and well, the official terminology said that in 1944 that they were resettled, that they would be repatriated, but actually they had nowhere to return to, because there was overpopulation in certain areas, especially superfluous population, especially in rural areas. But the western territories, well, stood open, and but not entirely, actually, because there were some German locals still there. The Polish population from the eastern territories of the Second Republic of Poland, they were clearly afraid of being settled somewhere in Germany. If they were to be settled there, they tended to settle close to the former border to be able to potentially flee from the new places of residence, probably, or if the prospect appeared of returning to their original places of residence, which was still being considered at the time. However, the international situation back in 1945 suggested that the changes could be, well, relatively permanent, at least relatively permanent. And this displacement of the German population created rather convenient prospects for settlers, both rural settlers or urban settlers also. assumed different forms, because there were some cities which became Festunge, which became strongholds, and for instance Gogau and Głogów and Wrocław, destroyed. There was 60-70% destruction, and also the Sudet's foothills, towns there, localities there, and that was those were places which remained well, relatively unscathed, apart from the plunder and pillage and the looting, but during the frontline battles, that was really intensified. In May 1945, the armies that entered these areas, however, they did not show off, in the cases of burning down, Nysa or Trzminica, or actually Oleśnica to a major extent, but they no longer did that. So, not the whole population, by the way, stayed in the Western Territories. No, the whole population that still stayed in Western Territories was supposed to be resettled. Well, there was this tendency, fueled also by outstanding opinion journalists and the journalists, this myth of Polish identity, especially of the Opole Silesia. Polish identity of at least a part of the Warmian-Mazurian region. And that local population was supposed to be an additional argument in favor of granting these territories to Poland. They said that the number of Germans was overestimated and that those areas were inhabited mainly by people of Polish origin. And that verification campaign, which started back in 1945, although on the one hand, as results from documents, during that campaign there were many abuses actually, and on the other hand it seems to have been quite liberal. And thanks to the provisions thereof, around 1 million people stayed, and some as people of Polish origin, some as people were Germans, specialists, experts, professionals, whose immediate departure would have been simply unfavorable due to economic aspects, unfavorable to the Polish state. And along with this influx of Polish population from the eastern borderlands, from the Kresy, there was an influx of Polish people from areas of central Poland. So they settled in different ways. People from Mazovia, people from the Warszawskie and Białostockie, Warsaw and Białystok voivodeships, they were actually willing to settle in border areas of the future Olsztyn voivodeship and areas which became part of the Białystok voivodeship. People from the three areas, Rzeszów, Lublin and Kielce voivodeships, located more to the east, tried rather to settle in areas of Silesia, Upper Silesia, or Upper Silesia, and Lower Silesia. In the case of Greater Poland, Wielkopolska, in the case of the border counties, especially when we're talking of the area of Lower Silesia, and then the Ziemia Lubuska, the Lubusz land, kind of later creation. In the case of Western Pomerania, these were people who came from the Free City of Gdańsk, which was also supposed to become part of the Polish state. But the Western territories, whose absorption capacity seemed very high, because in 1939 there was around 9 million people. In 1945 we're talking about a third maybe, and out of that this was supposed to become a place where different groups would also be able to settle, brought For instance, well, from various parts of Poland, and especially Lower Silesia was supposed to become a region for re-emigrants from Western Europe, as well as re-emigrants from Southern Europe, from areas located under Soviet rule or under the influence of communism, Romania or Yugoslavia. So those re-emigration tendencies lasted from 1946 to 1948-49. Nevertheless, this changed overall political situation, made them more symbolic, more of a token nature, really, after 1948. An important substrate, an important group, which supplemented the population of the Western territories, was a particular category of internal resettled persons, displaced persons, that was the Action W, was referred to as Action W. So basically these people were settled in Warmia and Mazury and in Pomerania and in Lower Silesia. So that was quite a big group, around 140,000 people, and this community in the 1940s, that was a very strongly mutable community. Some of the people who arrived in Western territories either went back discouraged by the conditions of life and terrified by the lack of safety and security, but some of them, for instance, the Jewish population we have mentioned, the flight which had started often in 1939, they continued that and kept wandering on, and actually Silesia became a place where Jews would settle after 1945, but for a large part of around 100,000 Jews would come back as part of repatriation from the Soviet Union, repatriation of remote areas of the Soviet Union, stayed in Poland for only a short period, terrified, among other things, by these manifestations of anti-Semitism, and we talked about the Kielce pogrom. They decided to travel on to Western Europe, across the pond, or to the Jewish settlements in Palestine, the newly established Jewish state, or what was to become the newly established Jewish state. So a change also arose in terms of the population. The German population, officially estimated at 500,000, more than 500,000 had been expelled, but most of those people, 4.5 million, were either Polish people or people considered Polish. So around 500,000 locals, around 1,700,000 repatriates, that is Poles coming from the eastern borderlands of the Second Republic of Poland via Siberia often, and around 2 million, and that was the most numerous group of resettled persons from central Poland and eastern Poland within the new borders. And as far as the first two elements are concerned, locals and people referred to as repatriates from the Soviet Union, as they were nicely described, their number didn't change later on, which is proven, among other things, by the results of this 1950 census. But it did grow by 50 percentage points. I'm talking about the number of resettled persons in 1950. There were nearly 3 million of them. And I mentioned here, or it has been mentioned here, that these Western territories were a ground where a new community would be formed, coming from different regions of Poland, nevertheless homogeneously Polish. But this is a certain myth that was created and was promoted in the 1940s and 1950s and beyond for political purposes, both internal and external, but not entirely did it have a lot to do with the reality, because Western territories were the area of the most diversified population in the then Poland, and if the population became uniform, it was because of the Holocaust, really, and because of the whole Jewish population that had perished, and resettlements of Ukrainian populations also from what would soon become the Polish People's Republic. But in the case of the Western territories, we dealt with quite a large number of Ukrainian people, at least 114,000, quite a lot of Jewish people, which is mainly the largest centers outside Łódź. These were Dzierżoniów, Pieszyce, Wałbrzych and Wrocław. In the 1950s, actually, Wrocław became the first city in terms of the number of Jews, even compared to second only to Łódź. And the biggest group which what also made these Western territories non-uniform was also the number of Germans. 65,000 was even the number after the resettlements, well, not to the Soviet occupational zones, but to East Germany in 1952, according to the estimates, at least by the administrative authorities. Nevertheless, according to the surveys, before the issuing of identity cards, around 200,000 people in these realities of Stalinism, this terror which prevailed and the fear that prevailed at the time, and those people officially declared themselves Germans, and this concerned mainly those from Warmia and Mazury. Around 20% of the so-called autochtons, the indigenous locals of the Lublin area, and for many years, people, this issue was explained using some aspects, the ineptness of policy or politics. But I believe that the reality was slightly more complex, or slightly simpler, actually, from another point of view. People tend to ignore the influence of the policy of the German authorities in the 20s and 30s. This Gleichschaltung process and this denationalization, Germanization process, it accelerated strongly, motivated also by economic reasons. So it can be assumed that in 1950 this situation did not change. Only after 1955 did certain migrations change the picture, the ethnic picture of the Western territories. So out of the around 6 million inhabitants of the Western territories, there were around 70,000 known Germans, more than 200,000 Germans among the local population. That is the lower estimate. 140,000 Ukrainians, 40,000 Jews, up to 10,000 immigrants, political immigrants, Greek, Macedonian, and Wallachians, and Moravians, and small groups of Russians, Gypsies, and Lithuanians. And actually, we're talking about numbers that are perhaps not great, but basically, in some voivodeships, the percentage of non-Polish populations was quite high. In the Olsztyn voivodeship, around 9,000, 9% Ukrainians, nearly 11% Germans. If we assume the declarations as valid, and why not? And in the case of the Koszalin voivodeship, Germans reach around 9%, Ukrainian population around 6%. So we are dealing with 15%. I'm not even mentioning the Opole voivodeship, and which existed since 1950, and the number of Germans was well over 10%. And the most gaudy, if we can put it this way, was the community of Upper Silesia. Although the percentages were not that high, but in some powiats, in some towns and cities, the minorities, their presence was noticeable, and actually there was mention in one of the papers of Wałbrzych. So around 14% in 1950, 14% Germans, and 5,000 at least Jews. And so we have 20% of the people in Wałbrzych who are not ethnic Poles. And if we add on top of that people, the French-speaking, resettled immigrants for France, then we have a full picture. So, Professor? Bearing in mind the exclusive nature of certain groups, especially territorially, which they kept at least until the mid-50s, because this is proven by sociological research, by Professor Przybylski, for instance, who actually fit within the Western study current after 10 years spent in Calcutta, and after the phase of the mass-scale migration movements, was still a conglomerate of locals of different nationalities and groups of people coming from somewhere, without roots, treating the new place of residence as temporary and unable to actually consider them their own habitat or fatherland. And they were not described as neighbors, but often as them, the Romanians, the French, the Jerrys, the Ukrainians, and all that.
Dziękuję, panie profesorze. Nie przerywałem wystąpienia, ponieważ wydawało się, że jest
temat tak jest skonstruowany.
Well, actually, I never knew that this subject must. So, in my attempt to interrupt you, Mr. Professor, actually, I didn't know that. Actually, it had to be led towards its very end, in order for the conclusions to be formulated properly. The questions will be left for the time after the third presentation. Resettlement of individuals, or those larger groups, that doesn't only apply to physical sphere, but also to mental and cultural sphere as well. I think the rest, the upcoming two presentations will come on about that. Jarosław Sterunek will be the first, the post-expulsion Lemko mythologies. The floor is yours, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and good afternoon. Hello, after 20 months of interruption of inability to contact you, as Mr. Field mentioned, we were actually missing that a lot. I would like to provide you a kind of, brief glimpse into my article entitled Post-Expulsion Lemko Mythologies. I'm not going to read it through. I'll try to recapitulate upon the most important thesis thereof. And first and foremost, I'll try to address the matter which I commented upon this article, and to what extent is it a scientific research as such. To me, history is a tool for the understanding of the present. Yesterday, we've heard something about the Lemko community inhabiting Lower Silesia, primarily the region of Lubin, Legnica, Wołów, partially also Bolesławiec. But they don't entirely know who they truly are. And I suppose this statement, a kind of a mental shortcut, but an important one which signalizes a sort of a tension. We might always say, what do you mean, someone not knowing who they really are? But we live in times of a very difficult search for new language to describe the phenomena around us which escape explicit judgments or explicit denominations. This is why we reach out for the history in order to understand the present better. So outside of two quotations, two references to my article, I shall skip the part that pertains to understanding of a myth or how a myth is defined. Let me just tell you, for proper introduction, the term methodology or methodologies, the use thereof was premeditated by me. I mean the understanding of methodologies, and I also used it in plural, the Lemko methodologies. So why the Lemko community? Because they combine elements that on one hand are very specific, but on the other hand are very universal in nature. Specific because it applies to Lemkos, a very specific group of people, regardless of how we define them, or regardless of how we can define them, or how they can define themselves. And trust me when I say we could actually devote a separate conference in order just to grasp this matter and not to answer this question or verify certain conclusions ultimately. But on the other hand, it is a universal problem because it highlights a certain mechanisms, universal mechanisms that function among people. As Berthes says, Barth says a myth is a means for communication. We try to communicate better or worse, but this is a universal thing. On the other hand, a myth tries to answer or try to provide answers to what hasn't been truly named. In the short history of myth, things, entities that escape words, escapes notions. So it might be surprising, but one of those notions is death. What happens to us once we come to an end of our mundane journey? Well, you can imagine how extensive the fields of philosophy you're entering now are. The very specificity of the Lemko problem is that it became so before our very eyes. Several dozen ago, there was the displacement of the Lemko people to the western lands, and generally 75, 78 years ago what happened was the depopulation of the Lemko land, because the entire process was actually spread on, or it spanned 3 years. But it still was a sort of phenomenon that happened before our very eyes. And despite the fact that there are numerous historical sources that pertain to this phenomenon, if we were to describe the beginnings of the Lemko land or the Lemkos themselves, we would have to refer to very scarce literature on the subject. The beginnings of the Lemko community function somewhere, but in a sphere that's never been fully named or fully addressed. The displacements I would characterize with 3 words, quite significant in light of the subject I'm addressing. They were of a common nature. So as you can look at the Lemko land map, well, actually, the first I've encountered on the internet, the green color being that it corresponds to on the northern side of the Carpathian ridges, the Lemko land, the Polish Lemko land, between 1943 and 1947 up to 1950, let's say. I'm always saying 1947/50. Whoever is interested in that, obviously everybody knows what I'm talking about. The Russia, so the entire region remain to be called thus, that it was incorporated with this, well, general body of regained lands, so to speak. It's not being drawn, it's not being highlighted on the maps of reclaimed lands, but thinking about the realistic stages of those times, at that time, actually, what was happening is a total changeover of population in the powiats of Nowy Sącz, Sanok, Leszno, partially Sanok, because the northern part thereof was already inhabited by ethnic Poles, Przemyśl, and so on and so forth. So I'm really addressing a broader context of the Vistula action. So we are talking about these districts, Krosno, Nowy Sącz, Sanok, where the Lemkos were to be found. Total displacement, total, let's say, annihilation, so to speak, of places, or total elimination of places, not physical annihilation, obviously, because some of these towns, most of these towns actually survived, these towns, some having been destroyed for many different reasons, different circumstances, but definitely significant changeover of the population happened. Another very difficult problem that appears, that surfaces in this context, is that this displacement or resettlement was very sudden. You might be wondering, because I mentioned that the years 1943, 1947, and then I'm calling it sudden or abrupt. But I'm referring to a situation where actually families living there in individual villages were displaced, which actually could be narrowed down to a very, very narrow range of actions and areas, which had its peak between the mid-1945 to 1946 and on a spot basis under the Wisła action happened on a point basis, but it also lasted until the year 1950. But the stories of ovens and bread, loaves of bread left hot on those, and a couple of hours left just to pack up your property and move. In the Lemko version of the history of the Vistula action, these are rather common. And finally, a third element, very strongly linked to the previous two, namely the traumatizing experience, for the very fact that it was common and sudden and abrupt, but also for the element or what the Lemkos actually experienced, the sheer brutality, the madness of this phenomenon, this process, which again could be commented upon in many a conference. So if we perceive this problem from such a perspective, we are dealing with a situation where people actually face something unknown to them, not named by them before. They try to explain what happened and how it had happened by making use of certain universal, let's say, schemata. The first such scheme or schema is the Paradise Lost myth. Here's the paradise. That's the Lemko land. And it's lost. It's gone. Obviously, I could refer to numerous examples from newspapers to songs to poetry of the Lemko culture. And I was writing this article, I realized that such a schema, such a mental schema functioned even before, when they were forced to travel across the ocean. They never, it was never the case that they always didn't want to go, but they always cried. Now, this Paradise Lost myth was not so fully experienced because it wasn't experienced to the fullest with the Vistula action and all the displacements, because it should be considered as a part of a single process. The Arcadian myth really resonated in them and has resonated in them ever since. Another mental schema, universal mental, would be the Promethean myth, or even the the myth of a victim that is innocent. And Prometheus was, to a certain extent, an innocent victim. So the second myth really should draw our attention, because juxtaposed with what historians do, well, cut long story short, studying the past, it turns out that interpretations of the past via the myth of an innocent victim might just explain to us the very discrepancies within the Lemko community as far as how they call themselves and how they define their identity as the Lemko people. One should also add that both those myths are complementary to each other. Both are used at the same time. It's a story of exile. It's a story of innocent victim as well. So to cut the long story short, what we deal with from the perspective of time, we're dealing with two items, two problems. One trend where the Lemkos actually display their affiliation with the non-Ukrainian roots. This is how they stress the Ruthenian origins or Ruthenian ethnicity or quasi-ethnicity. So this the Ruthenian origin is something that actually they praise as something that unites them. According to the other myth, the Lemkos are claimed to be Ukrainians, in fact. And again, here, in this respect, this may be perceived from the perspective of the myth of innocent victim. But the interesting thing is that insofar as this community tries to highlight their non-Ukrainianness, or the fact of being Carpathians or Rusins, and sorry for the shortcuts I'm using here, well matches a narrative that actually was consolidated for decades in periodicals, in the literature on the subject, in historical research, that dwelled somewhere on the fringes of the problem, asking questions why they were truly displaced since they were not Ukrainians. If they had anything to do with the Ukrainian conspiracy, these associations were of incidental, one-off nature, even if in the 1980s and 90s researchers started to speak of Sotnia Smirnego by Martin Russia, their support for the conspiracy, especially since there were just a couple dozen Lemkos involved in this conspiracy. Well, it is actually commonly known that they were advocates of the left-wing movement. They were active participants of state organizations. These elements were and are still used in this narrative, which consolidates the image of the Lemkos as non-Ukrainian people. You might ask, dear ladies and gentlemen, so what is the standpoint of the other party, the other side of the story, with their Paradise Lost myth? I don't think there are too many differences, but in my article I shall go into even deeper detail, because after all I have found something. With the innocent victim myth, I focus on the very displacement being the process of depriving one of their homeland, were evil as such. And I find no references, no explanations in the actions towards the Lemko people. And with reference to the Ukrainian conspiracy, what was accentuated probably was the self-defense elements resulting from being displaced or attempts to deny the displacement. And there is one more interesting element. What's interesting, what's important in this narrative is placing emphasis on the entirety of the Lemko land and not just focusing on the western Lemkowszczyzna, Lemko land. And even though these conspiratorial structures were less developed compared to the borderland of the Leszno and Sanok districts, Porańczyk, Wisłok Wielki and other municipalities there, I'm talking about the towns, municipalities that are based roughly at the end of the map to the east of the Lemkowszczyzna, bordering on the Bojko land, or the land of the Bojkos, as referred to in the literature on the subject from the Ukrainian perspective. By the way, Lemkowszczyzna is a term assigned to lands that extend significantly further to the east. So even if certain historical sources refer to the participation of the Lemkos in Ukrainian conspiracy, they refer to the entire area of the Lemko land. And yes, we do speak of the district of Gorlice. And yes, there was a conspiracy that included a dozen or so of the Lemkos, including persons from outside of this community, but there were also towns such as Wisłok Wielki, which in 1918, what happened was a gathering of sorts, or a resolution was adopted to establish a sort of a grassroots initiative and actually become integrated with Ukraine. To conclude, obviously, making use of the past in such a specific manner is nothing surprising. This is something we come across quite typically, namely, using the past or working through damnatio memoria. This is obviously a name assigned to a phenomenon that we are all well familiar with. I dare say that a far-fetched conclusion to which I come, based on what I've told you, is whether we truly make use of the right category or the right notion with regard to this community that we commonly refer to as the Lemkos, and whether what was named by the ethnographs of the 19th and 20th century and then accommodated and duplicated over decades by researchers, opinion journalists and national activists, whether this actually corresponds to the reality. For we might be talking about different solutions. Solutions such as this. The Lemkos, or former Rusins, because this is a term we assign when we, especially when we talk about the southern part of this region, were taken away of the Rusin reality in not entirely legitimate manner, or in a way that was not, again, substantiated. And again, we might devote the entire conference to this matter. Obviously, it is ingrained in ideological narrative as well. So the emphasis on the integrity of the Lemko community, it is not something that happens. It is so simply. The Lemkos tend to claim that we are all the Lemkos, irrespective of how different we are, whether we are for or against the unity of all the Lemkos. These questions can only be answered by not taking into account just one problem or one aspect of a problem, but different problems and different aspects, including this. But primarily by answering the question whether this category, the category we use in our language to describe the reality, is it truly adequate? Is it satisfactory? So that's my working conclusion, which stems from my research. We are trying, or we're working on updating our language for the very reason that we know a little bit more, and we have learned significantly more, and we know more about the past as well. So we should definitely stay open to such an update. For without this openness, what is in store for us is simply very emotional collision with the reality. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Bardzo ładną klamrą pan.
Thank you, Professor. You have gone full circle with your presentation, referring to language. Language is often underestimated as a form of describing the reality, finding out about it, and thinking about the reality, because how we communicate through language, you know, these traumas and the myths of culture the professor has discussed often are preserved in language, and hopefully the next speaker will talk just about that. Professor Małgorzata Misiak from the University of Wrocław. Just like the other panelists, Professor, the Lemko syndrome of expulsion, a linguistic testimony, and so syndrome, that's the expulsion syndrome, you know. Doesn't this mean what you are going to talk about? We have certain content here, certain info in the title.
Mikrofon.
I'd just like to correct the title, and hopefully the organizers will forgive me, because now the title is Na Czurzyni, Reconstruction of a Lemko Profile of a Resettled Person on the Basis of Memories and Reports. So Na Czurzyni means in the foreign land, that's what it is in Lemko dialect, and also ethno-linguistic profile appears here. Syndrome was an ethno-linguistics term in the old title, so I don't want to kind of bring these sociological historical connotations, but this title seems to be more adequate, so I hope you'll forgive me for changing it. And in my text I used the notion of profile, actually, developed by Lublin linguist Bartmiński, Lapo and Mayer-Baranowska, and profiles, according to them, are variants of a specific image constructed from a specific perspective, created by some dominant factor, some dominant feature. And an ethno-linguistic profile is a portrait of sorts reconstructed from a certain point of view. For instance, before I go on, because another adjustment, I won't talk about the profile of an outcast or of an exiled person, but I will talk about the profile of a resettled person. But let us talk about the profile of a Lemko peasant, which is a picture composed of the features of an inhabitant of a village. So syndromes collected from the point of view of an inhabitant of a village, from the point of view of a peasant. So finding themselves in the new reality, trying to find a place for themselves in the new reality, trying to adapt. So profile is a semantically complex unit, and the basic unit of analysis continues to be a quotation expression which points to a specific feature, namely a descriptor in the ethno-linguistic terminology. So descriptors make up syndromes, and syndromes build profiles. So this semantic structure has many layers to it. It's vertically zoned. So the material I'm presenting actually results from long-term research I conducted into the status of the linguistic and cultural identity of the Lemko community in Poland, and this is an analysis of memories, of recollections, and that's a collection I referred to of 34 interviews or stories collected using the narrative interview method, and half of them were recorded in Polish and the other half in the Lemko ethnolect. And the basic underlying assumption, which might seem banal, involved recognizing that if people say something, that means it's important to them, but on the other hand, only that which has been expressed and or named exists. And this kind of research attitude refers to cognitive science, which looks at language and thinking comprehensively. And the theory of the linguistic image of the world means that language interprets reality, and this image is including language. And this is a complex of judgments on the world, on people, things, and events. So the linguistic image of the world is, by its nature, a subjective picture, a collection of convictions, beliefs, and values reconstructed from the point of view of a specific subject, always entangled in some time in history. So always there's some kind of interpretation of reality. And stories obtained in this way fit within a discourse of remembrance, of recollection, but they are not treated as a historical document, but as a genuine, albeit subjective, image of the past, recovered in the memory of the participant of certain events. So the respondents would be born in the 1920s, 1930s, and the mean age of the respondents, of the interviewees, was 19. So they usually had mature personalities, already developed personality, aware of belonging to their own ethnographic group. They had a sense of community. They had a certain picture of themselves or their place in the community. They were attached to their homeland, the Lemkowszczyzna. And the respondents were conscious participants of the events. They told us about in the interviews, and well, not us, but they actually recorded in the interviews, and their memories referred mainly to their direct experience. And the key to distinguish the respondent group was the uniform experience in life. And according to the concept of the notes of memory of the French historian Pierre Nora, for him history was to a large extent symbolic and would unfold in pictures reconstructed in memory. So this is a kind of transitory generation, the group of narrators, because their biographical experience fits within somewhere in between the experience of the First World War and the experience of expulsion in 1947. And from their displacement in 1947, the Lemkos found themselves in a situation of constant problematization of their identity. And expulsion was an experience of 3 generations: the grandparents, the parents, and the children. They can be characterized as the kind of the exiting generation, the active generation, and the entering generation in terms of the stage in life. But the youngest ones were those who started their adulthood suspended between what had already passed or was passing under the very eyes and that to which they had to adapt in the foreign land. So they should be actually considered a classic transitory generation. Their cultural and linguistic identity was determined by the trajectory of the expellee. And this is the trajectory of the biographic process. One of the process structures singled out by F. Schütze represents a turning point in the narrator's biography, because as a result of external circumstances, the way of seeing the world and the reality is completely transformed. And the expulsion of 1947 is actually a watershed moment in their experience, and basically redefines their lives, and so it divides all the individual histories in 2 parts, before 47 and afterwards, because from 1947 onwards, the Lemkos have no influence on their fate. The decisions were made for them about leaving their homeland and where the new home would be located, and this introduced a sense of lack of security, disorganization, and suffering. And the reflection started on their own identification, a reflection forced by historical circumstances, and the Lemko exile profile becomes to be built, a portrait constructed from the point of view of a person deprived of their land, a person forced to change the place of residence. I'm not going to address this, I talked about it earlier, but I would like to attempt a reconstruction of a different profile. The Lemko resettlee, a person who found themselves in a new political and social reality, trying to find their place in it. And the social political situation was new, and consequently there was a new social landscape. And the relations between the Lemko and the others started to redefine themselves. And the Lemko resettled Lemko became unintentionally a participant of conflicts with an ethnic background, which they hadn't encountered in the Second Republic of Poland. So the picture of a pre-war Poland emerged from the memories, caring mostly for Poles, although tolerant towards the Lamkos, but treating them marginally, assimilating, polonizing, with poverty in rural areas, with the economy in the hands of Jews, living out of the Lemkos work, and with the conflicts, maybe not social conflict, maybe social conflicts, not ethnic ones. Only the resettled Lemkos experienced ethnic conflicts, and Lemkos' neighbors in Lemkowszczyna were above all Poles. On top of that, there were Jews and Gypsies. And out of the all national ethnic groups, only Poles would accompany the Lemkos through all the phases of their personal history, pre-war, wartime, and post-war. And the pre-war Polish neighbors, those known, namely those familiar neighbors, for instance, fellow villagers, and those who were not neighbors, were not a threat to the Lemkos. Poles were generally perceived as someone who was tolerant and did no harm. And the Polish-Lemko relations deteriorated suddenly after the Second World War. The Lemko, a careful observer, decided that, quote, yes, it depends on people, you know. Also, the scope of the term Pole becomes extended for the Lemkos, and before resettlement, the category of national belonging was very clear, but in the post-war reality, it became blurred, and the Lemkos in the foreign land encountered Poles who failed to match their image of Pole, developed and taken from the realities of the former Galicia. And for the period just after the war, there is a great mobility of the Polish population caused by the post-Yalta changes of borders. The so-called regained territories, informally called the Polish Wild West, are settled with inhabitants of the eastern, of the former eastern borderlands, and regions, some regions of central Poland, re-emigrates from Yugoslavia, Germany, Belgium, France, but also Lemkos. Some came there due to historical necessity, others in search of adventures, others yet with a hope for a better and richer life. The inflow in population, although ethnically and linguistically Polish, differed in terms of customs, language, well, the way they spoke the language, clothes, habits, and mentality. And the Lemkos saw this Polish diversity perfectly well. And the category of the real Pole, so-called real Pole, was something known to the Lemkos from their own pre-war experience. And the Lemkos distinguished four essential categories of Poles in a foreign land. Poles from the former eastern borderlands and Poles coming from the interior of the Soviet Union, mixed so-called Poles from beyond the Bug River, the resettled Poles, those from the east, those from Tarnopol, the Ukrainians from the east, those from Russia, those from central Poland, those from Warsaw, Poznań, and the re-emigres Poles from France. But German this term is not used to define a Pole from Greater Poland, from Wielkopolska, and that was actually mentioned yesterday. And in scientific studies, the criterion was adopted for the territorial origin of population in the classification of the individual groups of settlers in the so-called recovered territories, and the same way of perceiving the people from living in the Western territories is seen in the Lemko reports. And what is interesting, according to the formal classification, Lemkos are assigned to the group of settlers from so-called Central Poland, and the researchers actually assume that this category covers the people living in the territories which used to belong to interwar Poland and stayed in its borders after 1945. And this classification appears in the introduction to Pamiętniki Ostatników Ziem Odzyskanych, Memoirs of Settlers of the Recovered Territories, edited by Zygmunt Dulczewski and Andrzej Kwilecki. But what is interesting, the Lemkos saw themselves as people coming from Poland, and that made them differ from those from the east. The territorial classification of settlers is a kind of general knowledge because it appears both in sociological studies and in the memoirs of the individual settler groups. But in the case of the Lemkos, another classification appears which kind of clashes with the image of the pre-war Pole, the so-called real Pole. So that Pole who is no more, who passed just as the Lemkowszczyna. They were from there, from that time, and from that place. And in a new post-resettlement and social political reality, the syndrome of Poland, a neighbor in the foreign land, appeared. A syndrome very complicated in terms of the system of elements. It's not a profile yet, by the way, it's a syndrome. The system of elements in which the contradictory features, positive and negative ones, were included. And this polarized system actually renders this kind of transitory status in the mutual Lemko-Polish relations. the Lemko came to the so-called West with a strong sense of harm. So some behavior of Polish neighbors consolidated that status. Some it encouraged them to revise their impressions. And well, so again, Poles treated, quote, Lemkos badly, but also helped them, called them, Ukrainians and people from the Ukrainian insurgent army, but on the other hand, learned Lemko language and used to go to events with them and had fun with them, exploited them, stole their property, was spiteful, but on the other hand, helped. So these are reports about the behavior of neighbors, and these negative descriptors definitely made Lemkos feel less at home and led to the need to self-identify again. For instance, the category of the false Ukrainian, so someone who was not a person of Ukrainian nationality appeared, and in the case of Poles, its source was coming from the east, so-called. In the case of Lemko, that was the national propaganda that announced the arrival of Ukrainians to the Polish population. And in the so-called regained territories where different groups met of the resettled population, for Poles, especially those from the former eastern borderlands of the Second Republic of Poland, the Lemkos were Ukrainians, but for the Lemkos, the Ukrainians were the Poles resettled from the eastern borderlands. The Lemko-Ukrainian contact was therefore something that happened only at the level of the identification of Ukrainians verbalized from Poles and addressed at the Lemkos. So the resettlement forced them to give different answers to identity questions. Who are you and where are you from? So the question, who are you? The answer is, in the recollections, I'm not Ukrainian. So this is an answer through negation. So this actually answers the question, who are you not? This structure of an answer may actually prove that one is hiding their identity subconsciously, and this does not appear in fragments of recollections that refer to the Second Republic of Poland, because there it's said clearly, we are Lemkos, or we are Polish citizens. And the question, where are you from? Well, the answer answers in a way the question, who are you? But the response, where are you from? I'm from here, I'm a local, is one of the most basic identification strategies and emphasizes the relationship people have with the nearest surroundings of their land. And if they have to leave their territory, this is modified in a compulsory way. And the question, where are you from? Well, the response should be from there, not from here. So for someone who knows what fate befell the Lemkos, this is clear, but for others, this may only indicate a direction, and it is imprecise enough to hinder identification of the subject. So again, it is a way of hiding one's origin. Territorial identification, linguistically speaking, is verbalized above all by using textual operators of content referring to the reality being presented. So in our area or in our community, as they say, and using the forms our and ours, and these indicators appear juxtaposed with other indicators of territorial identification, creating a multi-element series. So the expression in our place or in our community actually refers us to a community exactly, and so this basically identifies the narrator's community, and so this points to a strong emotional relationship with the place being discussed. And so Lemko is someone who is in this syndrome, in this Lemko resettled Lemko profile, is someone who's from there. So the place, even if lost, appears as a real point of reference. And an analysis of material allowed us to actually extract the descriptor of being from there. So the sense of religious separation also became more clear in the other land, and as it clearly results from the reports in the first period after the resettlement, the belonging to a Greek Orthodox denomination became a kind of metonymy of identity, and it was externalized in context of others. So the accents such as Greek Catholic and Orthodox were nearly synonymous with the ethnonym Lemko, because they clashed suddenly on the religious plane, I mean, the Lemkos and the Poles, and the need to continue religious practices, well, and this idea of being separate, this intensified the resentment on the part of some Catholic priests, and so they became a diaspora community, the Lemkos, and the resettled Lemkos, symbolically still tied to Lemkoszczyzna, building at the same time their cultural and linguistic identity in the foreign land. And this resettlement therefore revised in a substantive manner the set of elements making up the identity universe of the Lemkos. So this is a bi-religious identity. So apart from being present in Greek Catholic or Orthodox churches, they started to manifest a dualism. They started to attend also Catholic service and bilingualism. So apart from the ethnolect, they would speak more often Polish, more often compared to what they did in Lemkoszczyzna, and a bi-territorial identity. So apart from the private homeland, the Lemko gained symbolically a real small homeland in the West. So the Lemko reports and our palimpsest, actually, many layers semantically speaking, and it's as an ancient parchment where you can discover the multiple layers and read a different cultural text. And this manifested itself in the multi-segment opposition, us and them. So the Lemkos, the others, our faith, your faith, our language, your language, and our land, your land. And once again, it turns out that without the historical context, one cannot penetrate into the deeper insight of the very identity of the Lemkos. And in the foreign land, in the new social-political realities, the profile of resettled Lemko was formed from the point of view of the resettled person. So this is much more extensive and much more semantically complicated than what I am presenting here, very synthetically and very rapidly indeed. So also, I would just like to signal this and point your attention to this set of syndromes and descriptors contributing to it. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Everybody fits into the time frame. It was definitely worth listening up to the end of every single presentation. I hereby open the discussion on the three presentations we've listened to. Are there any questions? Anybody willing to ask any questions?
Proszę bardzo, pani Barbara, proszę bardzo.
Okay, hello. Thank you. I have a question to Professor Chryciuk. I mean the term autochthon. According to Andrzej Saxon, a person called autochthon is Prussians, those from Silesia, or the Aborigines, native Lusatian Sorbs. How do you address this matter from the perspective of what you were saying? Well, yeah, obviously, that's just a semantic matter. Obviously, this notion is indeed used very frequently in the literature on history, but also in sociology, in biographies, and it roughly means one that is native to the given land, to the given region, territory. For a while, actually, a kind of a nativity category was tried to be introduced as synonymous to being autochthon. So I was using this term actually as used in the literature on the subject, namely a person living there before 1945, symbolically, obviously speaking, before the changeover of population, regardless of ethnic origin or national, actually, origins. However, I have to admit that in the 1940s and 1950s, there was a sort of saying that an autochthon is a former citizen of Germany or one that was living outside of Poland's borders of 1939, while native people, or native peoples actually, well, this description again contained this category. However, once you've get into analysis of certain specific descriptions, including statistics, also sociologists of, generations preceding Professor Saxon highlighted the fact that the autochthon category includes German people as well, because they inhabited these regions as well. This is a rather colloquial understanding, common understanding. The Masurians, Silesians, Poles obviously as well, we might conclude that depending on who was using the notion, it might have different meaning. Sorry for actually interjecting, but I have a question now to Małgorzata Misiak as well. What troubles me is certain overgeneralizations that you used in your presentation. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, 30 memories constituted the basis for your paper. And according to the biographical method by Schitzer, obviously, I do understand it. It blends well with this theory. However, my doubt is the following. The picture that you painted was very coherent, and I mean the picture of the Lemkos as a community. And you shall probably agree with me that by no means is this community so inherently coherent. There are many memories of the Lemkos displaced from the Soviet Union or from the western parts of the Lękowszczyzna. There is an almanac from the seminar of Krynica, where there are some written pieces which apply to manuscripts that pertain to the pre-war period. I believe that should also be taken into account, or at least highlighted. Then there are also memories of the Lemkos who were moved to what was referred to as the central work camp in Jaworzno. The persons that were associated with the Ukrainian conspiracy that I've mentioned. So this generalization is kind of disturbing. Those Lemkos, other Lemkos, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure if there is any justification that could be spoken about based on what you were talking about that would actually enable us to use these generalizations. Okay, thank you for this question or remark. Okay, you're right, Professor. However, while collecting these materials, I wasn't choosing those 34 memoirs according to any sort of specific key. It's not that I was reading through them, it fitted my theme, it fitted my subject, so I adopted it. It was a pity, actually, that it was just one memory of Lemkov from Eastern Lękowszczyzna that perceived Lękowszczyzna slightly differently. It was a pity. I really regretted having not a indifferent or something of a diverse nature. I also regretted that I was preparing my article based on these memoirs only, but it opened up a space for discourse. It was just a beginning, a tool that can be used for analysis of a number of other memoirs, because this is by far not a closed subject, and I agree completely. The universe of identity I consider to be an open set in which certain elements can be extended. They can change their place in the set, they are added, they are removed from this set. I just try to fill it in with my material, and I strongly advocating the very fact that it's by far not a closed work. It's not also an ultimate answer to the question of what the Lemko identity is. I'm not even sure whether there is an answer to this question. The Lemko is one who speaks of themselves as such. It is to a certain extent a simplification of all these strategies, and I've again regret to say that I haven't encountered something that was of a different nature. There was unification such as identification. I'm Lemko, I am Polish, I am Ukrainian, full stop. I am a citizen of Poland. Again, a specific identification, regardless of what it means. I'm from here. I'm not from here. Again and again, these are the identification statements of the Lemkos which I studied. So again, this is an open set. I was also describing a certain method of research, but again, I was stressing that it was developed based on the 34 memories that were picked at random, actually. So I regret that I didn't come across a part of a single person that was, well, very scarcely commenting about that. It was actually surprising to me that I actually happened to deal with such material, especially since in the interviews that I conducted, again, I didn't encounter those names. I took 70 first persons from the Lemko choir that I was or song and dance ensemble I was questioning, I was interviewing, and again I was surprised hearing from them. I was surprised by the results I've obtained. What I wanted to introduce to you was a sort of a profile, and I was focusing on highlighting the very fact that the historical conditions actually legitimized some further questions that had to be asked, or made us reflect upon the past, a reflection that might have not been there if not for this conference, for instance. And again, such questions and such answers appear always when there is the other present there, because it was focused on the other. And that was my point, to highlight the very consequence of the displacement in the Lemko community. Maybe such questions would never have been asked, such reflections would never have been formulated. However, based on what happened to them, willy-nilly, triggered certain responses, and I wanted to highlight just that. It was synthetic very much. Well, the table at the end actually is plenty of various descriptors which don't necessarily explain to us how we treat those texts, how we treat those input materials. Every single one of them is supported on a number of extensive quotations, so this picture is quite extensive, and the profile I presented, it was just a drop in a bucket of water. I was obviously thinking how to synthetically actually describe it all, whether it was just possible at all, but it was just a presentation made on the basis of my material, or a kind of a description or proposal of a method that can be applied and extended. Can I now ask a question? So it's not a quid pro quo. Still, though, I wanted to ask you, Professor, about your opinion on the following matter. The myth of lost place, lost Arcadia. It is undeniable, obviously. That's precisely how they perceived Lemkivszczyzna, being idealized, obviously, the ancient homeland, which is associated with the creation of land on a place, plus the displacement. Hence my reflection, whether you think that it actually started significantly earlier. The longing for the land definitely dates back to some previous times, or the syndrome of a victim. It could even been, tracked down to times of the First Republic of Poland. Shouldn't we actually link it to Talerhof? That was the first time when the Lemkos became victims and were deprived of the land, not knowing why. I suppose that was the first moment where they had to leave the Lemkivszczyzna for whatever reasons. And again, this innocent victim syndrome, they were not responsible for anything. They had to explain to themselves why they were treated like this. The awareness of Talerhof is clearly marked in their memoirs in an interwar period, but it is clearly vivid until this day and age as well. again, this is my thesis, and I'm asking whether you agree with that, that there was actually this the whole series of mishaps and tragic developments in the fate of the Lemko. So thank you actually for this question, because it gives me an opportunity to, chat a little bit more. As I've mentioned during my presentation, all these themes of having lost something and the longing were surfacing here and there, and I'm not going to sing in the Lemko language, I assure you, but if I had a song that if I went to the end of the world and so on and so forth, if I crossed the ocean and so on and so forth, but I shall not, for I don't want to leave my land, and if I had left it, I would have longed for it, and so on and so forth. Now, this is the theme, the leitmotif that existed ever since this identity, this ethnicity was created, I think far before Talehov, the First World War. The internment camp of the First World War in the it was then used for political reasons, a situation that was supposed to expose this non-Ukrainian ethnicity or the anti-Lemko attitude that actually contribute to placing those Rusins and Lemkos in the camp. If you read through the pieces by Szymka from Wrocław Wielki, you would again find themes of losing things and which is not going to be related to Talehov, but rather to the Eastern European Republic. So there is this universal, let's say, matrix that is used for in different ways. Some use it by adding the Talehov, some say about America, and even pre-Talehov motives, because the displacement or the flight of the Lemkos to America started at the end of the 19th century. Other researchers will add to this mental matrix such themes as those that we are not used to associating with the Lemkos. Unterleben or Spilka, I don't know if he was a Lemko originally, but he was telling some stories related to this movement of the Communian Republic in 1980 and the loss that was associated with that, which has nothing to do with the Talehov. However, the themes are surprisingly similar. I'm not sure if I could associate it with the Talehov in such explicit way. That would be the simplest answer to your question. So I agree, obviously. To me, just the Talehov is a point in time when we're dealing with this undeserved penalty, undeserved punishment. It is something different from the flight across the ocean or the end of the Republic. It simply begins and opens up the series of undeserved punishments. And again, those self-governmental entities of the Lemkos, I have a reflection. There was this informant from Florinka, the western part of the Republic, so to speak, that essentially wanted the Lemkovszczyzna to be incorporated into Czechoslovakia. And my informant was from a family descending from a duke. And according to memories of my respondents, my interlocutors, so he was highly educated, and the group of my interlocutors, and again, some memories were here and there, but as far as the awareness of the existence of the republics, it was not that at all. It was surprising to me. I wanted to get to know more about that. We are talking about 1918, 1921, so the years which don't span too much. And again, I'm talking about a person who was informed. I was fully conscious and On this note, just two sentences. Firstly, I won't recall the name. Mr. Wichniański, the surname was it. The perception of the Talahot that is completely disparate to what we are used to, so to speak. That's one thing. And secondly, a peasant, and we are basically talking about peasants, a part of the families of Wędzelowicz and Holaki. The peasant was always feeling like the one that actually gets beaten up without doing anything wrong. Excuse me, as the moderator, I shall now close the discourse, unless there are further questions, and obviously there are. A shotgun question to Professor Chryciuk. I appreciate you being too cautious about the thesis of homogenization of the Polish people directly after the Second World War that was supposed to apply to entire theory of the new Poland, while it actually applied to the lands where actually Jews were persecuted, plus the Vistula action, while on the western land there was this very non-uniform, culturally and ethnically speaking situation. So the question about social homogenization in the east, in central Poland, when is the time that you would say that this process could come to an end in the western lands? Obviously, if you could comment upon further decades of the post-war Poland. And another very short question to Professor Misiak. You mentioned a little bit about gender. Yesterday, a lot was said about gender. Why Lemko and only Lemko and not Lemka, which would be a female grammatical form of the same term, which is basically male? Was it because only men were given the voice to speak up, or actually women were calling themselves using more masculine forms of the noun, or whether simply it was just the form that did not settle down? And I'm wondering what the plural of the term Lemko would be, Lemko, Lemki, Lemkis, and so on and so forth. A bit of grammar question now. As far as the homogenization of the western lands, that was a process which lasted until 1950s and was not even close to being closed in the 1950s. Optimistically thinking, I say that it was kind of according to what the state government, what the state authorities wanted to achieve, and they claimed that the processes were significantly advanced. And indeed, in certain studies, like the aforementioned, not yet professor, Kazimierz Grzygulski, there is some information that all these processes of homogenization actually started in the second half, started to accelerate in the second half of the 1950s. However, despite it all, there was some stabilization there, both material, but also certain political stabilization mentioned after 1956-57. Also, the discontinuation of those massive tendency towards leaving was observed, especially leaving to Eastern Galicia or to the Volyn region, or actually getting accustomed with the reality of the given place, under certain coercion as well, obviously, successfully discourage people from living. And one of the most serious elements was also the role of the church. In the 1940s and 1950s, the church was supposed to help the new communities to actually become rooted in the land. And the role of the priest, who also was displaced from the east and from the eastern border, and especially from the southeastern regions of Poland, actually And then, because of the absence of the priest, certain processes was actually also causing the fact that such leaders or pioneers were no longer needed. There was also the generational change and changeover, as well as other alterations caused by certain, let's say, well, HR management policy of the church. Getting used to the given place was very important, but equally important was the role of integration. When the given priest was changed, that also changed. One of the most important aspects as sociologists of the end of 1950s and beginning of 1960s mention, and the phenomenon which is very important here, namely the gradual exiting of those regional communes incorporating people from Central Poland, Eastern Poland, the frontier Poland, and so on and so forth. On the one hand, that happened at school on this level, but with more elderly people, that happened through marriages. By 1950s, actually that was happening on a sort of internal manner, like a man from Lviv was looking for a woman from Lviv for matrimonial purposes. Further, this amalgamation process was clearly visible in the 1960s and 70s. That was happening while the domestication of the landscape caused integration as well. But we were simply dealing with yet another generation that didn't know these places. The longing for some land was also something typical, but in a second generation they tend focused on the current problems. So I think that's the typical thing for the 1960s, while in the 1970s a homogenization of these communities happened. But I think that these processes actually continue until today. The landscape domestication, the cultural landscape domestication, or feeling like a citizen, or the beginning of considering the surrounding reality as a small homeland. That's one more thing. I believe that one of these elements that provided for such symbolic bond with the land, how it was documented, was the very fact that after dozens of years, on the 1st of November, on the All Saints' Day, you don't really have to, travel long distances, because we can pay tribute to the dearest of us who have left us, who departed, while staying at a place. Very briefly, Professor, please continue. Yes, obviously there were women, but I'm just using a form that is simply adopted in the scientific literature. That's the generalization, kind of a stylistic generalization that matches the general statements. There's no reason, dividing them between men and women, because it's just a term that is stylistically adopted, assumed to apply to a certain group. As far as names are concerned, again, I was not introducing this terminology. Professor was speaking about lemkos. Officially, the term Łemko is in the dictionaries. I think Łemek, in a correct Polish language dictionary, plus it works. Yes, I'm talking about the official naming. Łemek, as a term in Polish language, is more colloquial. Łemkini is the term for a woman, but it's rarely used. Colloquially speaking, the lemkos themselves, they call women Łemka. Not very elegant, isn't it? I'm just thinking about the whole process of the formation of the notion. That was as far as the dictionary is concerned, and, well, this is the uses. I think the life will teach us. The more talk about the lemko, the more this subject becomes a common and certain grammatical form that will simply prevail. I think this discussion can continue enough. Why we have installed 2 more panels and 5 more presentations, so we have to wrap it up now. And I'll give the microphone because significantly past the schedule. So what are we doing now? 2 minutes of a technical break. And obviously join us for another panel.
Dobrze. Będzie pan profesor prowadził kolejne wystąpienie gdzie indziej, tak? Będzie czy tutaj? Tu, tak? To może powiedz.
Nie, zostajemy, proszę państwa, tylko...
No let's